Hello there, a very good evening and welcome to another edition of Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today, India, Sri Lanka and the world. Of course, when it comes to Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka's international relations, much has been spoken of about this subject on Face the Nation. We find ourselves at the cusp of yet another important event here in Sri Lanka, the arrival of the Indian Prime Minister here in Sri Lanka. It's after a hiatus of several years that an Indian leader of that stature is making their way to Sri Lanka. And of course, there are several agreements that are slated to be signed, several important events that we are looking forward to take place once the Indian Prime Minister arrives here in Sri Lanka. Amidst all of that, there is also concern as to what will be signed, what agreements will be made, and most of all, will these agreements be detrimental to Sri Lanka? Will they be beneficial to Sri Lanka? And overall, how will they affect the everyday lives of all Sri Lankans? To discuss these matters and more, of course, we've got with us an expert panel. Starting off, we've got Attorney at Law Javid Yusuf. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us on our program today. We've also got Shakthi de Silva, a lecturer in international relations. Thank you very much, Shakthi, for coming on our show. We've also got Nilanthan. He's the director of the Center for Law and Security Studies. He's a defense analyst. Nilanthan, thank you very much for joining us on our program today. And we've also got Dr. Rohantha Athukorala. He is the vice chairman of the World Rural Tourism Council. Thank you very much, Dr. Rohantha, for joining us on our program today. Starting off with Attorney at Law Javid Yusuf. Sir, speaking about especially the arrival of the Indian Prime Minister to Sri Lanka, there is much anticipation behind his arrival. There is also concern being raised from the opposition as to what will be the outcome of his visit to Sri Lanka. Moreover, what will be the outcome of the agreements that are slated to be signed once the Indian Prime Minister arrives in Sri Lanka? Could you weigh in on all of these discussions surrounding the arrival of the Indian Prime Minister to Sri Lanka and maybe give our viewers a little bit of an understanding as to if there is any merit to the criticisms and the concerns that have been raised in the run-up to his arrival?
Yes, thank you, Shalan. As far as the news in the public domain, we don't have much information as to what these agreements are going to be. But I strongly suspect that these will be normal, formal agreements without much direct impact on the lives of the people. And overall, Prime Minister Modi's visit is a goodwill visit to close the bonds between Sri Lanka and India. Because as we all know, there is always China in the background. So all the time India is concerned about building and cementing relations. So I think this whole exercise is part of that. Because if you recall, President Andrakumara Dissanayaka's first foreign visit was to India. And even before they came, he assumed office, well into the campaign, India invited Andrakumara Dissanayaka. I think they saw
he toured several of their factories.
Yes, and they saw which way the wind was blowing, and they thought this is a potential leader of the country. So they've been doing that and building it. And of course, there are many reasons why Sri Lanka and India have to have good relations. There are security dimensions, but it's an age-old relationship, cultural, religious. There have been ups and downs over the years between India and Sri Lanka, but latterly, certainly the relationship has been good, particularly soon after the economic crisis. India was the first to help Sri Lanka, and then of course the rest of the world rallied around. And that is again, it fits into India's neighborhood first policy. But what we as Sri Lankans should do in dealing with India or China or anybody else is all the time have the national interest in mind. We can be very good friends, we could differ on certain things, but that must be the core of our foreign policy. And I think so far the indications are that that is going to be the sort of signature of the government, because even some of the remarks and some of the news that has come out from President Kumar Dissanayaka vis-a-vis the Adani wind power project also indicates that they are going to be firm in relation to Sri Lanka's national interest.
So there have been many aspersions cast on the lack of information regarding the proposed agreements that are to be signed, the MOUs. I must concede to the fact that we in the media also haven't been privy to maybe as much information as we would like. But is this an anomaly? Is this something usual?
No, I think it's always an advisable thing for any government to keep the people informed. So then there's less room for speculation. There's less room for people who are that way inclined to raise fears among the people and so on. And in this case too, the government does not seem to have put out to the public what are the areas, what constitutes these agreements. Normally you have MOUs which reiterate the good relations between the countries and how each want to help and all that. Those are the usual diplomatic stuff. But I think it's important for the government
even to publish those. Even the routine agreements.
Yeah, because then there's no room for speculation and for people to look on the dark side, or people who want to create some mischief.
There are those who even claim that maybe Sri Lanka's sovereignty is at stake. Maybe consequences post Indo-Sri Lanka agreement are in order. Is there any rationale to this?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so at all.
Okay, thank you very much, Attorney at Law Javid Yusuf. We now move our attention to Shakthi de Silva, lecturer in international relations. Shakthi, speaking of, again, India and Sri Lanka relations, we've seen the issue of the Kachativu Island coming to the forefront again with the Indian Prime Minister's visit to Sri Lanka. See a resolution being passed in Tamil Nadu to reclaim Kachativu Island, and also the resolution also included several other requests to the central government to intervene in the release of Indian fishermen who are in Sri Lankan custody along with their boats, and also to maybe deter the Sri Lankan Navy from taking action in the north. Do you think these discussions, especially regarding the fisheries issue, the Indo-Sri Lanka fishing issue, which has been an issue between both countries for as long as anyone can remember, do you think those discussions or discussions on those matters would also feature prominently during the Indian Prime Minister's visit to Sri Lanka?
Sure. So let me start off by thanking you for the invite, as well as issue the usual disclaimer. My opinions are my own, not of any organization I'm affiliated with. Now, in terms of the Kachativu issue, this is identified or should be identified by the Sri Lankan government as a legal issue. The Kachativu Island was given to Sri Lanka according to the 1974 and 1976 agreements. Those are bilateral agreements. In terms of the current issue, the Indian government tends to view the Kachativu issue as a humanitarian issue. This is a consequence of the livelihoods that are impacted in terms of the Indian fishermen that come into Sri Lankan waters and fish around Kachativu as well as in our waters at large. I believe that the issue will be raised up, particularly because if you look at statistics, 2024 we had close to 560 Indian fishermen arrested in Sri Lanka. This number, if you look at statistics, have been rising year on year. This is a serious concern both for India as well as for Sri Lanka. Some of the suggestions, and there's been a joint working group since 2016 to discuss and resolve this issue, but we don't quite see a tangible outcome anywhere soon. It will most likely be on the agenda. However, I don't think a conclusive resolution can be reached at this moment unless we have the political willingness by the South Indian governments, particularly Tamil Nadu, which has a lot of fishermen coming into our waters, as well as the Indian fishermen themselves wanting to either engage in deep sea fishing or find some sort of alternative which is mutually acceptable for both governments.
Or give up on bottom trawling, I believe that's one
Yes,
of the main
bottom trawling is something that has been seriously problematic in the case of Sri Lanka, because Indian fishermen have been notified repeatedly. Many of the violators, in terms of those who have been bottom trawling and caught in Sri Lankan waters, are those who are repeat offenders, right? So this is a serious concern. Bottom trawling is one aspect of the violation of Sri Lankan waters by Indian fishermen. It's not the entirety of it. The larger matter is a legal matter in terms of crossing the international maritime border, crossing into Sri Lankan waters. An additional problem of that is bottom trawling done by some of the trawlers that are engaging in fishing activities. So yes, in terms of answering your question, I do believe this will be discussed. I don't believe that we will see a resolution anytime soon. But it is heartening to see that there's political will by the Indian government as well as the Sri Lankan government in trying to push this through. Because if you look, a couple of weeks ago, there was a consultation between Indian fishermen and Sri Lankan fishermen. They came to Sri Lanka to discuss this issue.
The Sri Lankan minister also was present.
Exactly. So there is positive developments in that regard. However, I don't see that being resolved anytime soon until the central government as well as South Indian governments, state governments, as well as the Sri Lankan government can reach some sort of mutually acceptable outcome involving the Indian fishermen.
But in that entire equation,
Sure.
the Sri Lankan government can only control the position of the Sri Lankan government. The Indian central government and, well, the provincial governments in India, of course, the state governments, with regard to that aspect or the agreement on that front, there's nothing that Sri Lanka can really do, is there?
There is. We can definitely advocate as the Sri Lankan government to the Indian central government to take some measure on this. It depends on the relationship also between the state governments as well as the central government, right?
And the constituency of the state government.
And the constituencies of the state government, as well as you saw earlier, this became a very hot topic when elections were drawing near a couple of months ago. So we need to essentially depend on the relationship between the Indian government and the central government and the state governments, as well as in our own measure. I think the Sri Lankan government should consider reaching out to the state governments as well. This is something I don't see the Sri Lankan government having taken up, right? And this has been discussed particularly in relation to attracting investments from South India, as well as encouraging trade from South Indian governments. This is particularly important because some of the largest or fastest growing economies of state governments within India is in South India. This is an untapped market in terms of export of goods, in terms of investments. But the historical relationship between the South Indian governments as well as Sri Lanka have not been the greatest. And as a consequence, we haven't seen that much of political willingness by the Sri Lankan government to make an outreach to these South Indian governments. As a consequence of that, we've got this problem.
Thank you very much, Shakthi de Silva, lecturer in international relations. We'll get into a more in-depth discussion as Face the Nation progresses, of course, today. We now move our attention to Nilanthan Niruthan, Director of the Center for Law and Security Studies. He's a defense analyst. Nilanthan, now, speaking about national security, we know that Sri Lankans love their national security. We're very concerned about it. We always have been. Speaking on the national security aspect and, of course, regional security, Sri Lanka has had several issues, I would say, in the past. Not abnormal issues. I believe all countries have these issues. It's how we deal with it that really matters. India is our closest neighbor, one of our closest allies, important to this entire equation of ensuring national security. China, on the other hand, the global superpower, also important. There has been some friction between India and China. Do you think that under the new government, based on the few months that they have been in power, there has been interactions between President Athukorala Dissanayake, Indian government, Indian high-ranking officials, President Dissanayake, Chinese government, Chinese high-ranking officials. Has he been able to play his cards right? Is it too early to call?
I think it's far too early for us to call it at this point. So, for instance, if 6 months from now, if we sign a whole new bunch of defense agreements with China, then that would create a stir, and once again the public discourse would be, are we going too close to China? So I see the problem, if I could just answer your question with a basic international example. So let's look at Israel and Saudi Arabia, right? Two countries that are very close over the last 6 to 7 decades, very close partners of the United States. Israel is close, but it has its own strategic doctrine and capacity. Saudi Arabia is also very close, but until the war on terror, Saudi Arabia was almost completely dependent on the United States for a security guarantee. So, in my judgment, just one man's opinion, our ideal option is to be the Israel to India's USA rather than the Saudi Arabia. Now, this, I'm not talking about the political stances of the Israel-Palestine conflict and all that, obviously. This just goes into the strategic equation where our partnership with any large nation needs to lead to strategic empowerment rather than strategic dependence.
Or disempowerment.
Or disempowerment, right? So if we were to use the Israeli-Saudi example, the Israelis were empowered by their alliance with the United States, while the Saudis became dependent on the United States when this partnership went forward. So either way, our only option, regardless of whom we pick here, we have to make sure that the end result is empowerment rather than dependence.
So, do you think that Sri Lanka has had, given our history, historical dealings with both India and China, do you believe at any point of time have we been complacent, have we been lax, have we gone down that road of dependence as opposed to, well, your suggested ideal route of empowerment? Have we done that before?
No, we've always been, just look at our foreign policy over the last 75 years. Our foreign policy and our defense policy are both the hostage of whichever new party comes to power. Throughout the Cold War, we flipped and flopped between the two blocks, depending on whether it was the SLFP or the UNP in power. Over the last few governments, once again, we see that whenever a new party and a new government comes in, our foreign policy and our strategic partners just radically change. We don't even have a piece of paper listing down what our strategic objectives are, let alone getting the political parties to agree on it. So if you were to ask me whether the baby can walk, my answer would be the baby has to crawl first. We've not even gotten into the baby crawling stage where we have...
Has the baby been born yet?
Well, the baby's born. We're all here, thank God. But unfortunately, we don't have any document listing out what our strategic priorities are.
But Nilanthan, now, as a member of the, diplomatic studies, defense studies, as an academic as well, why is that? I mean, Sri Lanka would have invested several $1 billion in paying for its diplomatic staff at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, staff at foreign embassies, so much, and we have nothing to show for. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, if you can show me what we have to show for it, I would be more than happy to change my mind. But from what I can see, we have no real strategic partners.
But why is that? As a part of the community, as a part of the, as a person who has access to maybe some of the inner circle, some information that we don't have access to, why is that? Why don't we have anything to show for?
Well, so number one, we have this obsession with not really picking a side. So no matter where you go, if you were to advocate for picking a side, you would automatically get cast as either a secret agent of the Chinese or the Indians or the Americans or something like that. The church of non-alignment is very strong here in the sense that it's almost a biblical thing, and if you question it, you're a heretic. So there's that problem, which means that once again, we just play musical chairs with our strategic objectives. None of the political parties can get together.
But Nilanthan, are you saying that getting a set of strategic objectives in line is contingent upon us picking a side? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying knowing what our objectives are is step one, and we haven't even done that. I agree with what Mr. Yusuf said, that no matter whom we deal with, it has to be our national security that is the fulcrum on which we do it. But what is our national security? Can you get the political parties to agree? Each time a new party comes to power, our conception of our position in the global geopolitical game, our position on what we consider national security threat, whom we consider national security threat, all changes. So for us to prioritize it, we need to know what it is. If it's just US keeps changing, then what's the point?
So, Nilanthan, now the new government came into power on promises of doing things differently. There have been certain things that have been done differently, certain things are yet to change, certain things we don't know if they'll change, but that's at least what the people hope. So, in your area of expertise, international relations, strategic interests, do you see a shift to a different direction? Are there academics, other members of the community advocating for such a change? What's happening?
No, I mean, as far as the academic and foreign policy community and all here is concerned, I wouldn't hold my breath in terms of expecting anything groundbreaking from them in terms of like strategic thought and all that. In terms of the new government, look, it's more or less been a continuation of what we saw previously. And there are three areas which we can go into later on in the show on enhancing our energy security, on enhancing digitization, and on putting down some kind of framework through a defense cooperation agreement. I see all three as being a step in the right direction. I see all three as fixing problems that we need to fix quite urgently. I mean, if you are 9 months pregnant, Shalan, and the baby can't be delivered the normal way, we've got to go for a cesarean operation. We can endlessly debate the risks and pros and cons of a C-section, but if we want to save the mother's and the baby's life at some point of time, we've got to go in for that C-section. We need to do something. And we are 9 months pregnant at the moment in terms of our energy security, our economic security, regional security. We have major strategic crises staring at us in the face. And some of these MOUs, at least on those three pillars, I believe is a step in the right direction for now.
Thank you very much, Nilanthan, Niruthan. We'll get into that, get into an in-depth discussion, of course, as Face the Nation continues. We finally move our attention to Dr. Rohantha, Athukorala, Chairman of the World Rural Tourist Council. Dr. Rohantha, now, what do you see the arrival of the Indian Prime Minister to Sri Lanka as? I mean, is it an extremely positive development? Is it a negative development? Is it something that people should be cautious about? Because again, just like I posed the same question to Mr. Yusuf, there has been a lot of clatter and debate around his arrival to Sri Lanka, not in terms of asking him, don't come here, but as to what will happen after, especially these proposed agreements are signed. What's your take on that?
Thank you for the invite, and I think I look at the whole visit very, very positively.
Okay.
For two reasons. One is that I think from our Sri Lankan side, we must be ready with some very concrete discussions that can take forth post his visit. And the first one I would always focus on is our exports. I mean, I remember in 2004, 2005, our exports were about $600 million into India. And today, after almost 20 years, our exports are only at $850 million. So, and if you look at our export basket, we just send a few basic products, something like pepper, animal feed, areca nuts, which is not our core products that we send. And if you look at the total import basket of India, we are just 0.01%. We're just 0.01%. Now, if we have a challenge ahead in terms of bridging this gap, our trade gap is about $6 billion. And we have to see as to how we could, make it manageable, which is a task that has been given very clearly by IMF. If we could make our exports $3 billion into India, with our strategic sectors like apparel and tea going in, then I think this visit is going to be very, very useful. I mean, for 20 years, we have just gone from 0.6 to 0.8 billion. And if we can't just get at least 1% of the market of India, and India is special to Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka is special to India for many reasons. And you have the whole of the South Asian region falling apart. I mean, in my new role in terms of handling about 28 markets in our part of the world, you have so much of challenges in Bangladesh. Nepal is also going through tough times. Pakistan is absolutely under severe challenge because of the political issue that is in place. The only two countries which are doing good in the whole of South Asia is Sri Lanka and India. And the Indian economy, which is almost like a $4 trillion economy, is growing at 7%, and Sri Lanka is growing at 5% GDP growth. Now, things are looking good in terms of growth, because World Bank and IMF, everybody said we are going to grow only by 3.5%, but we have beaten that to give a 5.2% GDP growth. Now, if this visit can be used so that our free trade agreement can be further strengthened on two sectors very clearly. Can we get 15,000 kilograms of tea going in to India? And secondly is apparel. We have about 7 million pieces of apparel, which is under the free trade agreement. Now, very focused discussions if we could have and move this to say $1.5 billion to $2 billion. If you could make this, then I would say this visit is going to be very productive. And then from the tourism side, end of the day, you have about 326,000 millionaires in India, and about 35 million travel every year out of India to other parts of the world. Currently, we just get about 400,000 tourists coming to Sri Lanka as at 2014-24. So, if we could make this 750,000 tourists or 1 million tourists coming in, and we know that there are fantastic products which Sri Lanka appeals to the Indian, like the Ramanaya Trail, and that's something very special from a religious angle. If you could get maybe currently we have about $181 which are spent by a typical visitor who comes to Sri Lanka as at 2024. If you could make this $250 by attracting the key visitors out of India, I think these two fronts, if this is on the agenda, I think it's going to be a very productive, and I see it very, very positive.
Yeah, Dr. Rohantha, before I move on to the next round on Face the Nation, just one thing. You spoke a lot about what Sri Lanka can get, what Sri Lanka should ask for, and what Sri Lanka should advocate for. But this is a two-way street. What do you think India would want in return?
Well, currently trade is in favor of India. The total imports are around $3.7 billion, while our exports are just 883. So I think from a strategic side, we could ask at least our exports to go up $1.5 billion. And I think it's not asking too much from such a big country, which is like 99, we are just below 1% of the whole bill. But from a more strategic angle is that maybe some of our products can fit into the global value chain that is going to be useful for India. Maybe we can look at, there's a industrial zone that was sponsored, almost 90% was sponsored by India, which is the Athukorala industrial zone in Jaffna, which is about 3 kilometers from Palale. When I was working for the UN, I was in charge in terms of actually developing that. That's a beautiful 47-acre property, and now you have, I think, almost a daily flight out of Palale to Chennai. Then you have the sea travel also linkage. So I think if we can maybe make that an industrial zone, where we could even attract South Indian entrepreneurs to come and set up in that zone. The infrastructure is all sponsored by the government of India. So maybe that could be something in return that we can give, which is going to help both countries.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rohantha. We now move to the next round, the questions from our journalists. On my right, Niresh Eliathambi, and on my left, Shihar Aniz. The floor is open.
Start. Okay. Let me start with Shakthi, who is a well-known international relations lecturer. Shakthi, if you see the Indian relations, right, before the war and after the war, there is a difference, right? because we had this anti-Indian sentiment before the war because of the historical past, right? But still, that sentiment could be triggered at any given moment. Right? Even during the election, we have seen, right, this anti-Indian sentiment is easily triggered than any other, country, and there is a reason for that, right? Maybe during the war, what happened during the war, and then there is also allegation like India blocks the assets and they are not ready to give it to others, right? And the classic example is the Trinco oil tank farm, and then there was at one point also they had been handling this Mattala airport, right, for 2 or 3 years, and nothing happened, and then the deal was cancelled. Is the relationship, Sri Lankan relationship with India, right, is it opportunistic or is it more than that?
Okay, so the question was, is Sri Lanka's relationship with India opportunistic on the point of view of India?
Yeah.
Right. Well, let me get down to the basics of it. The two nations have had long-standing relations, civilizational ties, but if you look at recent years, the relationship has been on a more solid footing, particularly after Prime Minister Modi came to power. Now, in terms of whether the relationship is asymmetric, yes it is. In terms of power dynamics, it is very asymmetric. But that does not necessarily have to imply that the relationship should be, as you call it, opportunistic, right? Sri Lanka and India both gain benefits out of trade, I think, as Dr. Athukorala mentioned. However, we need to structure our agreements, be it on defense, be it on economic affairs, in such a way that particularly benefits, as Mr. Javid Yusuf mentioned, Sri Lanka's national interests. Now, the onus of that, or the responsibility of structuring agreements to our national interests, falls onto the government in power. Whether governments in Sri Lanka have been able to effectively do that is a moot question, right? So, if we are the losing party of an agreement, we have no one to blame but ourselves. India is going to come to the negotiation table trying to pursue its national interest. Sri Lanka should do the same. If we fail to sign or finalize an agreement to our benefit, then the responsibility should fall on us, because we should understand that every nation puts a lot of onus on protecting their own national interest, as with India, as with USA, as with Russia, as with any country, right? So, if we are to blame particular agreements or issues as one-sided or as opportunistic from the point of view of India in terms of exploiting, quote-unquote, Sri Lanka, we have no one to blame but ourselves, right? It is heartening to see that there is a new consensus that is developing in terms of understanding and reflecting about agreements. So there is new discussion about the defense agreement, for example, but as a consequence, as Mr. Yusuf mentioned, as a consequence of the fact that there isn't sufficient transparency, there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation that is rampant on social media. So, there is fears, therefore, that India is going to do something against Sri Lanka's national interest. Again, the onus falls on the government to clearly clarify what is going to be signed, how it impacts Sri Lanka in the medium to long term, and particularly challenge misinformation and disinformation started by opposition parties. Now, we still haven't seen that, although this particular administration came to power on the basis or on the promise that they will be more transparent than previous governments. We still haven't seen that. So that's sort of the issue. So in terms of opportunistic, we have no one to blame but ourselves if agreements are one-sided in terms of...
But why this anti-Indian sentiment still prevails and it could be easily triggered among Sri Lankans?
One of the biggest reasons for the anti-India sentiment is two things, really. One is misinformation and disinformation. That is structured around the belief among Sri Lankans that India is going to pursue its national interest at the expense of Sri Lanka. Right? India is a regional power, the hegemon, as one might argue, and as a consequence of India pursuing its interest, we might not be able to push our interest onto the table. So that's one argument. The second relates to India's behavior in the past with regard to the LTT, and I don't think I need to go into the history of it, right? But there's this fear, particularly among older generations, of what India did in the past in terms of the explicit, implicit support that was given to the LTT. So there's that historical grievance as well. Today, since I teach a lot of undergraduates, I can understand that the historical grievance isn't so much of a factor. It's more so, what is India going to do, and can we also exert our agency as we negotiate with India? That's the real concern that a lot of youngsters in particular have. So those two are the real reasons why there is this tension, there's this fear factor that's always at play, sort of the undercurrents in terms of the relationship between the two nations.
Nilanthan, you spoke of our country's strategic objectives and that we haven't really identified them. What would you say are our country's strategic objectives?
I mean, so
let's get the ball rolling on this. Maybe someone influential will take it up and put it into a better form. But
so the first thing for starters that we can decide on is in whose framework do we fit the best. So, for example, we have India's framework of a Sagar or Mahasagar neighborhood first policy. We have a China geopolitical framework of a Belt and Road Initiative. We have an American framework of a rules-based liberal global order of democracies. So the first conversation we need to have with some kind of party consensus is, where do we fit, or where would we fit best in these competing geopolitical narratives which give us the strongest leverage. So there, for instance, with both the BRI and the American system, you could argue that we are just a small cog in a much larger system. Whereas with the Indian Sagar policy, you could argue that we are more direct stakeholders in that geopolitical vision. Conversely, you could also make the argument that maybe it's better for us to be part of to be a small cog in a larger framework and attract less attention. I mean, you could work through some of these problems, but the first thing we would have to do is identify which of these visions gives us the most strategic leverage.
But are those different areas mutually exclusive? Could you be part of more than one?
You could certainly try once you reach a certain level of wealth and influence. If we were like Singapore, for instance, which, by the way, started off being extremely aligned and today is non-aligned after it's reached a certain position, or the ASEAN countries, which were extremely aligned when they started off, and today you could say that they are non-aligned to a certain extent. So at our position, given our size and our power, I think it has to be mutually exclusive. If not, we're going to be like a one-armed man trying to swim through a lake full of crocodiles, which is what we do right now. All by ourselves, like a leaf that just blows in these geopolitical storms with no real partner to engage with us on our terms. We only have people who come in to help us on their terms. So there needs to be some kind of understanding of our view. What is our worldview? What is our place in the world? India has an understanding of its place in the world. So does China, so does the United States. Most successful countries around the world, if you go down to it, have a very clearly articulated idea of where they stand in the world. And that's something that we have to start off with.
Just a follow-up question, Nilanthan. Non-alignment. There was a time when you had the West and you had the Soviet bloc. And it was perhaps convenient for countries like ours to get the best out of both, play them against each other, and then they would actually help us out in whatever we wanted, because they didn't want the other side getting in here. But since the Cold War ended, and it ended about 35 years ago, what's the point of non-alignment? I mean, the NAM movement, non-aligned movement, was very important. I mean, when the conference came to Sri Lanka in the mid-70s, it was a huge deal globally. But today, who cares where the NAM conference is, and who really cares about NAM at all?
From what I can see, only the academic community and the foreign policy community care about this, but they are still very, very keen on promoting this idea that non-alignment is our best option. As you rightly pointed out, in a world where there are just two competing powers, there is some strategic logic behind non-alignment, where it's a shield from geopolitical turbulence. In today's world order, it's a magnet for geopolitical turbulence. The other problem is that I am always suspicious of terms which sound very intellectual on paper, but it doesn't really mean anything in terms of actionable policy. Now, the three of you, put yourselves in the shoes of any person at the foreign ministry. Try to think of how you would come up with even a basic foreign policy draft document based on non-alignment. It means nothing. I mean, does it mean that on economics we align with one country, on security we align with another, on technology we align with another, or does it mean that it's going to be like a picnic table where you get the north and you get the south and you get the east, or does it mean that you just stumble along a forest like a blind man without any friends? This is just jargon that sounds good intellectually, academically, but if you were to actually try to break it down into actionable policy, you will see that it means nothing.
Dr. Rohantha, talking about our exports to India, you said a lot that we really don't have, I mean, our exports are negligible when it comes to India. But what are the products that we could focus on and develop which would find a good Indian market?
Niresh, there are two key products as per the free trade agreement that has been signed, which is one is the tea business and the other one is the apparel business. So on tea you get I think 15,000 kilograms of tea, which the utilization is about 2.5, 2.7% of the free trade agreement, while apparel it's about 7 million pieces. Once again the utilization is low. Now why I said I'm looking at it very positively is because one big reason as to why we cannot exercise is because of the non-tariff barriers which are being put from the Indian end. So what the technocrats and the absolute exporters say is that even though on paper you have a free trade agreement, when you go to actually go and do business, the non-tariff barriers come into play. And for that, you need a political pressure to make it happen. So I hope this time's visit, because both parties are very positive to each other based on the earlier visit that His Excellency had to India. There's a lot of camaraderie, a lot of friendship, and there was a lot of trust is what we saw. So why I strongly feel that we got to make this visit workable, and it should not be just a cultural event and a tick in the box, but I think we must say you have to help us to get our exports to 1.5 billion. We are doing, as I said, we do 800 million, Niresh. I mean, for 20 years we have been in that same status. We say that we are fantastic in terms of going and working with the Indians. I mean, all of us have worked in Indian companies, and even now I work in one of the Indian companies. So, you know, we can do business. And if we can't make this 1.5 billion, because we owe, I think, about 4 billion on the monies that were given to us during the financial crisis, we got to return this money back. So if this could be paid back by getting our exports into India, and as I said, we are just below 1% of the total import bill of India. Total import bill of India is $702 billion. We are just 0.012%. You know, so we're not asking for a lot. We are just asking for just below, just 1%. Give us 1% of the share.
Why all these discussions and negotiations on the free trade agreement and also comprehensive free trade agreement talks did not go through? I mean, all of them have stopped partially, or they were basically suspended, mainly because Sri Lankans did not like them.
See, it's tough doing business in India, let's be very clear. There are a lot of rules and regulations which are sometimes unsaid, Shyam. I mean, that's the truth. So there are exporters of tea who have sent goods to Bombay, and then you have all the NTBs coming in like saying you want certification, certain quality parameters to be set, that ultimately this exporter burned the tea in the Mumbai port. It happened. And so, to that extent there is deterrence because of the rules of how it works in India. So now that we owe money to India, I think if we could make this visit work by making sure that we can get entry into 2 or 3 product sectors. Let's not look at a lot, because anyway we export only about 14 items. That's what constitutes almost 90% of our exports. So if you could just focus on 2 items, let's say even if you focus only on apparel, and if you can get the 7 million pieces into India post this visit, I think it's a big win.
So Javid, Yusuf, now Indian relationship post the end of the war is being basically compared with the China, what China is doing in Sri Lanka. And I don't know, it's a manipulation by the politicians, but always this concern of intervention by Indian, central government in Sri Lankan politics is there, right? Whether it's actually been done or not, we don't know, but the concern is there. And that intervention is being seen as a deterrent to move forward with Indian, whether it's, Indian projects or political talks, for any progress, it's being a deterrent. Now, if you take China, they don't intervene in Sri Lankan politics, right? They have their own way and they do their business, right? Now, how do you see this, as a barrier to move forward with India, and how can Sri Lankan government address this issue?
No, I think that has happened obviously because the historical relationship between China and Sri Lanka and the relationship between India and Sri Lanka have been different. In India, we have had various issues, not only post-independent, even before that, invasions from South India. And all these things cloud the minds of ordinary people and can be easily used and manipulated by those who want to create a bogey. So the thing is, India is virtually at our doorstep. India naturally has an interest in what is happening in its backyard, as it were, and that's why in the 1987 Indo-Lanka agreement, one of the annexures required the voice of America, which was stationed in Iranavila, being controlled, because they are all the time conscious of that. But be that as it may, I think at this point of time, particularly after the economic crisis, Indian-Sri Lankan relationships are at a high. So we need to leverage that in our favor, because we have to speak to India with their goodwill, get certain things done. I come back to this issue of the Indo-Lanka fishing dispute. I think that these fishermen, Indian fishermen straying into our waters, there are many consequences. One is the northern fishermen lose their livelihood, our resources are plundered, and also bottom trawling destroys the future resources. So we have a lot for us to gain, and if this problem is resolved. But unfortunately, we have been virtually pussyfooting around this. We have not really taken these things head on. And I think this is a good time, as I said, because of the relationship. And Prime Minister Modi's visit, I like all leaders' visits, the leaders only sign, or documents are signed after a lot of groundwork is done. maybe this government didn't have the time to do the groundwork, so it has to be done afterwards. For instance, the working group on this fisheries dispute should be empowered to work towards a final solution for this. And for that, we have to put the ball in India's court. It is only India which can patrol the waters. And if India is very powerful in the marine sector, so if they control the fishermen, the chances of all these clashes, Indian fishermen dying and all are minimized. And we can suggest to India that they must also do a lot of groundwork in South India. That's, and don't forget that many of the trawlers that are coming here, and it's not the poor Indian fishermen who are really, these are big businesses owning trawlers who send these people in and out. So we have to consciously leverage this. Having said that, I must also say there was a reference about the foreign service. The foreign service, Sri Lankan foreign service, has produced great diplomats in the past, outstanding, who have shone in the world. But latterly, you will see that the foreign service is completely submerged by the politicians who are at the helm of the ministries. So that's why you don't see them coming up, and they work under a lot of constraints in terms of economic resources if you compare with other countries. Remember, in the Middle East, one of the countries trying to promote commercial activity, there was just one commercial secretary there who had to go through the yellow pages, find out who are the people whom you can tap. I mean, that replicates everywhere. So there are good people, they should be encouraged. And the great thing about Minister Lakshman Kadirgama was he got the advice of experienced foreign service personnel in the foreign service. But he would take the decision finally after this after taking into consideration the pros and cons. And at that time, one of the strong arguments that the Sri Lankan government was putting to foreign governments and prospective investors to come and invest here was that this opened up the large Indian market for them if they invest here, because the free trade agreement between India and Sri Lanka gave them access to the Indian market. But the problem also, which has I think not yet been resolved, is that in India, whatever the central government agrees to certain concessions, it's a federal government. So at the federal boundaries, there are a lot of blocks. So these things have to be worked out, but that's a lot of groundwork to be done. But once the other side starts respecting us, then we can get a lot of things done. For that, our image must also remain. For instance, I'll just stop with this. You recall when Karuna Amman was deported from England after the Sri Lankan government had given him a false diplomatic passport. I mean, that is integrity of the whole nation. So that creates bad impressions. So we have to always have the moral high ground in every way. And though I said the last one, I just can't resist this non-alignment thing. Though there is no non-aligned movement now, that does not mean we can't be non-aligned. We can be non-aligned in the sense that we are not an appendage of one country. So, but we pursue our own interests in the best possible way in using diplomatic, diplomatic efforts, and it can happen. I mean, that's the way the world is designed. So, I think to cut a long story short, we must use the goodwill that Sri Lanka and India enjoy at the moment to leverage many things for our benefit.
But on that point, Mr. Yusuf, now, when initially the non-alignment movement began, it was in a completely different world. It was almost a bipolar world where there was one side and then there was the other. You either aligned with the left or the right, and then there was a group that said, no, we are neither for you nor for them. In a scenario where it's no longer a bipolar world, are you now suggesting that the term non-aligned has been redefined? Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is non-aligned is non-aligned. That is, you're not aligned to anybody. Say take Sri Lanka.
But the meaning has changed. Nilanthan, you want to weigh in on this?
No, I mean, obviously there will be a great deal of debate. My only point is that during the Cold War, for instance, there was a convergence of theory and policy. Right? So I care about policy. I don't really care about theory. There was a non-alignment theory out of which you could create a non-aligned foreign policy.
Okay.
But right now, there's a huge divergence between theory and policy where non-alignment is a theory, but I have no idea how you would translate that into some kind of actionable foreign policy. It's a very academic term that sounds very intellectual today, but when you break it down, I don't see how it can translate into a workable foreign policy that somebody can actually articulate. And that's my main problem.
What you're saying is where Sri Lanka is right now, the position that we're in, both financially, globally, geopolitically, our influence in the world, all of that is, the climate is not acclimated for us to be non-aligned.
Yeah, whatever path we pick has to be translatable into policy. It can't just be some theoretical academic construct. It has to be something where you can actually articulate a policy path forward. And right now, there's a lot of this outdated jargon, which is precisely that. It's jargon. But can you actually break it down into a way forward? No. That's my problem. It's not like I came out of my mother's womb opposing non-alignment, right? It's just that it's not really practical today. If you can actually work it out, then fine. But I don't see how it can be worked out.
No, the point is,
you work it out.
Non-alignment in relation to a non-aligned movement is non-existent now because of the reasons you mentioned. It's no longer a bipolar word. But when you are pursuing your own interests, your national interests, it is natural that you are going to be non-aligned. That now, say, if you take the Sri Lankan context, we are not going.
But what if Sri Lanka's national interest requires us to align ourselves with a movement?
Can I jump in here?
Yeah.
Definitely, yes, please.
So, I think we've got both sides of the coin, right? We've got those who are against non-alignment on the basis that it's academic jargon, and those who see the practical benefits of it. Okay, so first we need to distinguish between non-alignment as a movement and non-alignment as a foreign policy. Let's get our terms clear. Non-alignment as a movement is not what is under discussion. Non-alignment as a foreign policy is. So what does non-alignment mean? Okay, we need to get our terms clear. Non-alignment as a foreign policy implies that we are not signing on to a military alliance, say Japan-USA defense agreement type of alliance, NATO type of alliance, as well as that we do not give political allegiance to only one country at the expense of others. Okay, let's be clear about the terms. So non-alignment served Sri Lanka's interests in a bipolar world because we were able to say we will align, or we will tilt rather, with one party or the other provided that either party provides us benefits. So SW was a very effective exploiter of this system by obtaining benefits from both the capitalist world as well as the socialist world, right? We've had many different leaders in Sri Lanka during that 1945 to 1990 period who were able to use this non-alignment in ways that benefited Sri Lanka. Now, there's a lot of discourse surrounding this notion that because we have moved from a bipolar world to a multipolar world, that we should therefore abandon non-alignment, right? The world is more or less capitalist, and who are we aligned against? So, we don't have to be aligned against anyone. We are non-aligned in the sense that we do not give our political allegiance to one party at the expense of all other countries, nor do we sign a military alliance, aka NATO type of agreement, right? In that sense, what do? We keep our options open. We have issue-based arrangements so that whenever a particular economic decision, let's say, is useful, or economic agreement is useful for Sri Lanka, we sign on to that country. We are not party to one country's sphere of influence. In that sense, we keep our options open and we link with India, we link with China, we link with the EU, we link with the United States. Whichever party is providing an agreement that is beneficial to Sri Lanka, we have the freedom. This is very important. We reserve the freedom to choose on particular issues. Now, if we are aligned, which is the opposite of non-aligned, we are denying ourselves that freedom. And I ask you, is that the type of environment that we want to go in? A situation where we willingly deny our freedom of making decisions that is based on our national interest if and when they emerge. We would, by aligning ourselves, restricting our own freedom as well as leading that, as well as that might lead to that country imposing restrictions on us, because we have already stated we won't move away from you. So if I am already aligned to you, what agency do I have to push you to do something in my benefit? I have already given you my wallet. It is up to you to decide how much of the money you're going to give back to me. Whereas I am now, by being non-aligned, keeping my wallet with me. And I am open to choose whichever way I want to spend the money on. That's the big difference. So this
Nilanthan,
is why
do you
I
agree
disagree
with
with Nilanthan.
Yeah, so I mean, but so this is the usual argument that's put forward, right? That we would somehow lose our agency and we would lose our autonomy and all that. Do the Israelis gain from being aligned with the Americans or lose from it? Do the Saudis gain from being aligned with the Americans or lose from it? Do the Myanmaris gain from being aligned with the Chinese or lose from it? North Korea went nuclear and got away with it because they were aligned with the Chinese. This idea that us being aligned somehow takes away our strategic autonomy and we become some kind of slave state is not true. Secondly, it doesn't mean that if we were aligned with a country, we just boycott everyone else. This is the other caricature that they always go to. Saudi Arabia is more than happy to speak to. You can see Putin and Mohammed bin Salman high-fiving each other. But Saudi Arabia is still strategically aligned with the United States, which is how Saudi Arabia got to this position in the first place, right? I mean, just statistically, anybody watching this program, just come up with a list of countries that that you consider are prosperous in this part of the world, and you tell me whether they got it through alignment or non-alignment. You don't need the two of us debating this. You can do this yourself sitting at home. Just come up with a list of countries that you consider to be successful, and you ask yourself which model works. At some point of time, if a car doesn't work for 75 years, someone has to say, hey guys, this car's not working, right? We've been following this framework for such a long time, for so many decades. At some point of time, someone has to say the emperor has no clothes. So if it works, fine. But these are just some basic questions that, like, caricaturing this idea of alignment is not really, and my original question still remains. All of this is fine. All of these justifications are fine. But how exactly does that translate into policy? I mean, this whole issue-based thing, India and China and the United States, that would only make sure that they are all angry. That on one issue we go with the Indians, on another issue we go with the Chinese, on another issue we go with Washington. That just makes it even worse. So instead of making just one person angry, you make everybody angry by trying to be, and this tendency to often sort of, try to go for options as if we were much smarter than we actually are, is one of the major reasons why we are in this mess in the first place. So I have nothing conceptually against non-alignment or anything like that. My major thing is, once again, policy over theory. Pick something that will actually translate into a policy path forward. We can keep all these debates and all that for once we're a prosperous country.
Sorry.
Rohantha, can I ask you, what are the other benefits that we should be working on with relation to India? Now, I know you're an educator as well, and there has been some interest in, Indian universities setting up franchises, whatever here, in the same way that we have so many Australian universities, UK universities already with a presence in Sri Lanka.
Very good question, Naresh. Because see, we have 171,000 students who qualify for university after A-levels.
Every year.
Every year. And out of that 171,000, you have 50,000 who get into national universities, which is the 17 universities. So you have 120,000 virtually, all looking at education with all the other franchise universities which are based in Sri Lanka.
I mean, they've passed their A-levels and qualified, but there's no room for them in our national universities.
Yeah, there's no room. So that 120,000 right now, the largest share goes to British universities. I mean, about 22 to 23 top universities operating in Sri Lanka on a franchise model, and there are now Australian universities which have set up their own university. So, I mean, we know that there's something right in India for the education sector, which is churning out fantastic talent, and that talent is absorbed by the multinationals in the world. If you take the top 50 global entities, almost 40 CEOs are all Indian. So we know that there's something right happening in India, and I think it's time that Indian universities also come into Sri Lanka and see as to how that talent base can be further built. So I think it's more to do with the whole value chain. Now, last time when His Excellency went to India, for the first time a joint statement was made that the education sector was going to be looked at in terms of expansion to Sri Lanka. Because in India, education is not a commodity. Everybody has the right to learn. So it's a strategic move that has been made. So in that light, I think there were a lot of universities from India who came down, including IIM, who want to come and set up. But then the center has to allow, and without the center approving, this market is huge. It's about 155 billion rupees.
Dr. Rohantha, just to bring in a bit of an economic twist to the quite fiery debate that was going on, because this is something that I also haven't been able to wrap around my head on what Sri Lanka's foreign policy should be. So, in an economic perspective, what do you think is better for Sri Lanka? Non-aligned, or finding where Sri Lanka fits and then taking that path?
See, let's look at it practically. I mean, if you look at where do we compete in the global scale, we find that, we have no option, but we have to tie up with somebody who is stronger than us. There's no option, otherwise we will not get into those value chains. Now, who are playing that global value chain? India, the closest. And if we are not going to have some form of policy which is linked, I'm not sure in what context. We are absolutely foolish. If somebody says that we should not tie up with India in terms of tourism, if we are saying that we should not have some kind of an agreement on our exports, why should we look at countries which are 25,000 miles away? As I said, Shalan, total import bill of India is $702 billion, total import bill. Now, this is on a $4 trillion economy. By 2040, the forecast is that the Indian economy is going to be 7 trillion. Obviously, their import bill is going to double. How much do we have?
How much can we offer?
That's the whole game in terms of value chain, and something that many are unaware of is there's a huge challenge that we are up against in the month of April onwards, and that is the SMEs, small medium enterprises. The Parata execution is coming to play, and the moratorium is off.
Was there an official statement that the Parata is coming back? I think
there were
the official statement was that the time for restructuring of SME loans on banks, the final date was the 31st of March. Does that conversely mean that Parata is going to come back on?
Well, all we know is that SMEs are yet to see what the banks are going to say. Because as at now, many people are not aware of this. In 2018, Shalan, SMEs contributed 48 billion and the NPLs was 3.4%. And by 2020, it was delivering 45 billion, NPLs had gone up to 13.9. And in 2022, once we said that we are bankrupt, the NPLs went up to 36%. And the SMEs yet contributed 38 billion. So the argument is that, these are the guys who innovated, these are the guys who took risk, these are the guys who believed in a dream, and they invested money to make that dream happen, and they account for 52% of the economy. Now, this vulnerability exists, and if you look at the export and the tourism industry, almost 70% of the tourism industry is SMEs, and almost 80% of the tourism, the export industry is also similar. So exports and tourism both are dominated by SMEs. So if we are not going to have some kind of action plan on how we are going to support the SMEs, there is 1.3 trillion